Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, March 3rd. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. Just 2 hours from now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will deliver his eagerly awaited historic address before Congress. Last night, he previewed his speech with an appearance before AIPAC. IBA's Eli Wogelanter has that story.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu opened his high-profile visit to the U.S. Capitol last night by playing down any personal dispute with President Barack Obama. He told a record 16,000 delegates at the annual AIPAC conference that he had a moral obligation to warn against the dangers of a U.S.-brokered nuclear deal with Iran. But Netanyahu stressed he was grateful to Obama and the United States for their support over the years and never meant to inject partisan politics into the relationship.
Never has so much been written about a speech that hasn't been given. And I'm not going to speak today about the content of that speech, but I do want to say a few words about the purpose of that speech. First, let me clarify what is not the purpose of that speech. My speech is not intended to show any disrespect to President Obama or the esteemed office that he holds. I have great respect for both. My speech is also not intended to inject Israel into the American partisan debate. An important reason why our alliance has grown stronger, decade after decade, is that it has been championed by both parties, and so it must remain. I plan to speak about an Iranian regime that is threatening to destroy Israel, that's devouring country after country in the Middle East, that's exporting terror throughout the world, and that is developing, as we speak, the capacity to make nuclear weapons, lots of them. And as Prime Minister of Israel, I have a moral obligation to speak up in the face of these dangers while there's still time to avert them. For 2,000 years, my people, the Jewish people, were stateless, defenseless, voiceless. We were utterly powerless against our enemies who swore to destroy us. We suffered relentless persecution and horrific attacks. We could never speak in our own behalf, and we could not defend ourselves. Well, no more. No more. The days when the Jewish people are passive in the face of threats to annihilate us, those days are over.
All eyes now turn to Capitol Hill for the most important speech in Netanyahu's career. Eli Wogelanter, IBA News.
Following Netanyahu's speech, U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice said in her address to AIPAC that members of Congress should not seek sanctions against Iran while talks are still going on.
I know that some of you will be urging Congress to insist that Iran forgo its domestic enrichment capacity entirely. But as desirable as that would be, it is neither realistic nor achievable. Even our closest international partners in the P5+1 do not support denying Iran the ability ever to pursue peaceful nuclear energy. If that is our goal, our partners will abandon us and undermine the very sanctions we have imposed so effectively together. Simply put, that is not a viable negotiating position. Congress has played a hugely important role in helping to build our sanctions on Iran. But they shouldn't play the spoiler now. Additional sanctions or restrictive legislation enacted during the negotiation would blow up the talks, divide the international community, and cause the United States to be blamed for the failure to reach a deal, putting us in a much weaker position and endangering the sanctions regime itself. Meanwhile, the Iranians are well aware that if they walk away from a deal, Congress will pass new sanctions immediately, and President Obama will support them.
U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power drew a distinction between politics and policy when talking about the dispute between the U.S. and Israel over the Iranian issue.
We believe firmly that Israel's security and the U.S.-Israel partnership transcends politics, and it always will. The bond between the United States and Israel is still a national commitment. It should never be a partisan matter. The bond runs much deeper than any one issue or any one generation. Now, as then, we cannot and we will not lose sight of that.
Israel Television's Yaakov Elon spoke with Abe Foxman about his impressions.
I think he did a good job by lowering the temperature, by specifically saying this is not disrespectful to the administration, to the president, by talking about us being a mishpacha. He used the word bipartisan as much as he used the word Iran. So I think the temperature is lowered, and I think also the administration has taken some steps that even though there are differences, and there are differences, I think, Yaakov, the Prime Minister's most important sentence was that we share the common goal on stopping a nuclear Iran. But the difference is, for the U.S., it's a question of security. For Israel, it's a question of survival. I think that's the essence of the disagreement. But that disagreement, I think, needs to be dealt with privately and not in front of cameras and not in front of applause.
How divided is the Jewish community on the issue of the speech in Congress tomorrow?
Well, the Jewish community is united on the issue of Iran, overwhelmingly, probably more so than even in Israel, and therefore it overwhelms and it overwhelms the different, the partisan, bipartisan issue. I think the Jewish community is uncomfortable to be put in a position where there are partisan players in the game of support for Israel, especially on such an issue. But I will say to you, I think more uncomfortable are Democratic members of Congress, because they want to stand with Israel. They want to be supportive. They have constituencies who want them to be supportive, and they want to be supportive of the president. They want to be supportive of the White House. So their dilemma is much bigger.
IBA Steve Leibowitz, who is in Washington, says the real star of the night at AIPAC was Susan Rice, to the surprise of many of those attending.
Rice gave what I consider to be a brilliant speech. A lot of people came in to listen to her, convinced that they don't like her and they don't like what she's going to say. They left the speech saying that was a brilliant speech. She got applause all throughout. A couple of times she got applause when she didn't really expect to get applause and didn't really want applause, because she had sort of made half of the statement that the AIPAC people agreed with before she went on with the buts side of it. But she was very, very good. The Obama administration has done a great job of softening up the AIPAC delegates to believe that they do have Israel's interests at heart. Susan Rice made a speech that I would say is one of the best speeches I have ever heard. The way it was built, the way it was laid out, the way it was convincing, and the deep feeling that she expressed for Israel on so many levels, from visits that she made and so on, and the Holocaust connotations and so on. Susan Rice did a great service for herself and for her cause, and I think won over a lot of the AIPAC delegates to at least not be hostile towards her.
As part of the Obama administration's strategy to counter Netanyahu's message during his U.S. visit, the American president explained the reasoning behind his Iranian policy.
We actually share a goal, which is making sure Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. That's something that I committed to when I was still a senator. It was a solemn pledge that I made before I was elected president, and everything that I've done over the course of the last several years in relation to Iran has been in pursuit of that policy. There is a substantial disagreement in terms of how to achieve that. And what it boils down to is what's the best way to ensure that Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon. Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks that the best way to do that is either through doubling down on more sanctions or through military action, ensuring that Iran has absolutely no enrichment capabilities whatsoever. And there's no expert on Iran or nuclear proliferation around the world that seriously thinks Iran is going to respond to additional sanctions by eliminating its nuclear program. What we've said from the start is by organizing a strong sanctions regime globally, what we can do is bring Iran to the table. And by bringing Iran to the table, force them to have a serious negotiation in which A, we are able to see exactly what's going on inside of Iran, B, we're able to create what we call a breakout period, a timeline, where we know if they were to try to get a nuclear weapon, it would take them a certain amount of time. And the deal that we're trying to negotiate is to make sure that there's at least a year between us seeing them try to get a nuclear weapon and them actually being able to obtain one. And as long as we've got that one-year breakout capacity, that ensures us that we can take military action to stop them if they were to stop it. Now, we're still in the midst of negotiations. What I've said consistently is we should let these negotiations play out. If, in fact, Iran is willing to agree to double-digit years of keeping their program where it is right now, and in fact rolling back elements of it that currently exist.
Double-digit years.
Double-digit years. If we've got that, and we've got a way of verifying that, there's no other steps we can take that would give us such assurance that they don't have a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran may not agree to the rigorous inspection demands that we're insisting on. They may not agree to the low levels of enrichment capability they would have to maintain to ensure that their breakout is at least a year. But if they do agree to it, it would be far more effective in controlling their nuclear program than any military action we could take, any military action Israel could take, and far more effective than sanctions will be. And we know that because during the period in which we applied sanctions for over a decade, Iran went from about 300 or a couple of hundred centrifuges to tens of thousands of centrifuges in response to sanctions.
But let's talk a little bit specifically about the Prime Minister. Susan Rice said what he has done by accepting the invitation to speak was destructive to the fabric of the relationship. Would you agree that it's destructive? And if so, will there be any consequences for him or for Israel?
You know, I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is sincere about his concerns with respect to Iran. And given Iran's rhetoric, given the extraordinarily disruptive and dangerous activities of this regime in the region, it's understandable why Israel is very concerned about Iran. We are too. But what's also a problem is when the topic of the Prime Minister's speech is an area where the executive branch, the U.S. President and his team, have a disagreement with the other side. I think those who offered the invitation, and some of the commentators who have said this is the right thing to do, it's worth asking them whether when George W. Bush had initiated the war in Iraq and Democrats were controlling Congress, if they had invited, let's say, the President of France to appear before Congress to criticize or to air those disagreements, I think most people would say, well, that wouldn't be the right thing to do. I guarantee you that some of the same commentators who are cheerleading now would have suggested that it was the wrong thing to do. I don't think it's permanently destructive. I think that it is a distraction from what should be our focus. And our focus should be, how do we stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? Now, keep in mind, the Prime Minister, when we signed up for this interim deal that would essentially freeze Iran's program, roll back its highly enriched uranium, its 20% highly enriched uranium, and so reduce the possibility that Iran might break out while we were engaged in these negotiations. When we first announced this interim deal, Prime Minister Netanyahu made all sorts of claims. This was going to be a terrible deal. This was going to result in Iran getting $50 billion worth of relief. Iran would not abide by the agreement. None of that has come true. It's turned out that, in fact, during this period, we've seen Iran not advance its program. In many ways, it's rolled back elements of its program, and we've gotten more insight into what they're doing with more vigorous inspections than even the supporters of an interim deal suggested.
If the Prime Minister wins re-election, will you be able to work with him?
Absolutely. We're working with them now on a whole range of issues.
Will you meet with them?
Yeah, of course. As I said before, the only reason that we didn't meet with them this time is a general policy. We don't meet with somebody 2 weeks before an election. I've met with Prime Minister Netanyahu more than any other world leader. And given the strong relationship between the United States and Israel, I would expect that to continue.
Meanwhile, Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif rejected as unacceptable a demand by U.S. President Barack Obama that Tehran freeze its nuclear activities for at least 10 years. This came as Zarif and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry today began a second day of talks in Switzerland on curbing Iran's nuclear program with the aim of securing a framework agreement by the end of this month. The negotiations are intended to persuade Tehran to restrain its nuclear program in exchange for relief from economic sanctions. Arab Knesset member Hanin Zoabi was attacked today when a right-wing activist allegedly threw a soft drink bottle at her during an election event at the Ramat Gan College of Business and Law. Police arrested a 28-year-old man who was among a number of right-wing activists from the anti-Arab Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power Party, who attended the event, including Knesset candidate Baruch Marzel. According to reports, a Palestinian flag was raised during the event, possibly triggering the violent protests by some of the right-wing activists present. The first round of televised campaign election ads kick off tonight, giving the public a chance to hear policies of all the parties running, with everyone attempting to win more votes. In an interview with IBA's Margot Dudkevich, Rafi Smith of the Smith Institute says he believes the televised ads will have a marginal effect on the parties vying for more seats on Election Day.
At the end of the day, you start with a campaign, you make all kind of various ways of putting out your message in the internet or whatever, or social networks. I think the radio and the TV, all those things will have some, at least on the marginal, but because it's a marginal election, okay, and every vote counts, it could have some influences.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't have election victory in his pocket, he says.
It's not yet. Depends. At the end of the day, I think the main factor would be if the Labour or the Zionist camp will get about 2 or 3 seats more than the Likud, then maybe things will be different.
While the Zionist Union is making headway, it appears the public still views Netanyahu as the best candidate for Prime Minister.
When you ask him if you have a favorable, who's your favorable guy, he gets at least 6 or 7 more points than Herzog. I think it depends on the type, the fact that people are more disappointed from Netanyahu than they favor Herzog at this point of time. So that's the dilemma of this election. Okay, it's only on one side there's a lot of disappointment, which comes out in the fact that more people want a change, but there's a problem of who's going to change. And that's basically what the election is all about.
Now, do you believe Netanyahu's speech before Congress will add more mandates to the Likud party, or the opposite?
A few days ago, about 42% of the people supported him for his speech. 37% of the people were against. But what you can see is that the fact that his own constituency, the people from the Likud or the right wing, they support him. So he's actually looking for support inside his camp.
Now, for the first time, we're seeing a united Arab list, and it seems it was a smart move to unite the parties. Is this reflected in the polls, or isn't there really a vast difference in the number of mandates they have until now?
Well, after the last election, previous election 2 years ago, they got close to 12 seats. They got 11 seats, but they were close, about 1,000 votes. They were short of getting their 12 seats. What we're seeing now in the polls, I think they're getting at least one more seat, at least at this point of time. The problem is, we don't know, up until the election day, will they come and vote? The turnout will be very crucial to that, okay? I think they have this time it looks like they have the opportunity to gain more votes than ever before, okay? But it all comes out to the turnout.
In the current election campaign, the public appears to be more concerned with social issues, he insists, adding Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to change the momentum.
What we're seeing in this campaign, which compared to other previous campaigns, is the fact that the social issues, whatever you take them, cost of living, housing, have much more weight, or people say that it has more weight on the way they look at the issues in Israel and the way they're going to, some of them going to vote. So that weight is coming up. Now, I think he's trying now to change the momentum, trying to get at the end of the day that his party will be the biggest party, or the leading party. He's trying to make the focus more on the security issues.
In local basketball action, Hapoel Jerusalem won its 5th consecutive league contest in an 89-59 trouncing over Hapoel Cholon last night at the Pais Arena in the capital. Yotan Halpern was top scorer with 20 points for Jerusalem, which all but put the game away with an early 21-2 run. The victory keeps second-place Jerusalem 4 games behind league leaders Maccabi Tel Aviv, which edged Maccabi Ashdod 84-81 last night at Yad Eliyahu. In local money matters, the shekel was mixed in foreign currency trading, while shares were also mixed on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Here are the late afternoon numbers. The weather forecast is calling for light local rain tomorrow in the north and center of the country. Here are the highs and lows for the next 24 hours at home and abroad. And that's all for this newscast. Erin Viner will be at this desk tomorrow. Please join her for more news from Israel and abroad. Until then, I'm Laura Cornfield wishing you a good evening and shalom from Jerusalem.